Plane ride? Who gave me? Oh my god, I made it all the way to Thailand and back, sleeping. My friend was like, I hate you. How did you do that? So, pot cookies is your best friend when you're traveling. But today what I want to do is I'm going to talk about cooking with cannabis. Now, I'm not a scientist, this isn't a lab, this is your kitchen, and I'm here to empower the home baker. The home baker is the person who's taken their 4 legal plants, chopping it down, drying it up. Now, if it's not beautiful enough to smoke, don't throw it away. Keep it, you just want to dry it. So what's interesting about cooking with cannabis is you don't need to do this great separation of church and state. You don't need to pull all the buds off if you're not a big smoker, and you don't need to cure it and manicure it. You can just make sure it's nice and dry and there's no mold or anything on it. So what I did, and here it is, I'm a baker, not a grower, but I grew 4 plants on my deck, and I thought it would be very fitting just to come. So this is the plant. It's actually got the fan leaves, whatever buds were in there. They weren't good enough for me to smoke, but they're good enough for me to bake with. And all of that stuff's good to bake with. Actually, all of your lower grade cannabis is really great to bake with, right? So it doesn't need to be the super expensive affair. Maybe you want to get cannabis that's clean, right? That's the most important thing. You want a nice, clean, organic cannabis if you can, because that just transfers into your cooking. So I like to do something when I'm cooking. So for years, everybody did the butter. God, get over butter, people. Move on, right? They even call this the magic butter machine. So cannabis just needs to be decarboxylated, fancy word for there's a carbon molecule on the cannabinoid molecule, or the carbon molecule, and if you apply heat, so fancy scientist told me this, if you apply heat, it knocks the carbon molecule off, and then you can get that cannabinoid into the receptor, right? So applying heat, and the longer you apply heat, the more heat you apply, the more carbon molecules get knocked off. This is a really sciencey way to think about this. But ultimately, any kind of heat will convert your cannabis, and any fat will convert your cannabis. So you don't need butter. Butter's just great because butter cooks fast. Certain oils like a nice high heat. Unlike olive oil, it does not like a nice high heat. Butter can take a high heat. Peanut oil, great, high heat, love it. Coconut oil, high heat, good high heats. But you don't have to use those things. You can use things like marijuana, bacon. You can use the fat from bacon. Any fat will work, any fat at all. You can literally take a fatty piece of salmon. This is my favorite thing to do in the whole world. This is the most BC thing ever. You take a nice fatty cut of salmon. You don't want the lean ones. And you know when you're cooking salmon and that white fat forms on the top? That is the greatest stuff. So what I would do, hypothetically, pretend this is a piece of salmon. I have it all in the thing. It's this simple to make cannabis and salmon. I would take it, I would rub this like any other herb. Sometimes when you're rubbing it gets your bacteria, it gets the oils moving, and I would just put it all over that salmon. We're pretending this is a piece of salmon. I couldn't find one out here.
Yeah.
We're inland.
Right. I was going to bring salmon, then I'm like, but hypothetically, you could just rub a little bit of salmon on there, and then I like to put a little rock salt on there, a little gray salt, people. It's way tastier than that pink Himalayan. I'm so sorry. It looks good pink, but gray salt is where the flavor's at. That's a total side note. Okay. Then what I would do is I'd cook it in the oven, but I'd probably foil it a bit. Now foiling is going to pull that white fat up from the salmon. That salmon's going to convert with the cannabis on the top. And then maybe in the end you could take it off and just cook it a little bit on the top or not. And then I have done this and served this at parties, a million parties. Please do this at your next party, okay? First, it's not super strong. You can decide how much cannabis you want to put on there. But the number one question people ask me at a party when I serve them marijuana salmon is, oh my God, that's delicious. What's the herb you put on there? And I said, marijuana. And they go, I know you put marijuana in there, but what's the other herb? It's marijuana. So here's what I learned. And me and the gods knew this, and now you guys know this. Marijuana is supposed to be on salmon. It's supposed to be on salmon. And when you go home and try this at home, you'll be like, she was so right. Marijuana is supposed to be on salmon. So I have a thing called Marijuana Recipes Made Easy. I think for a lot of years, especially in these kind of communities, we'd take our crop down, we'd have all this extra shake, and we needed to get rid of it because they thought of shake as the same, they weigh it the same. When I got arrested for cookies, say this is a box of cookies, they're like, how much pot does she have? They weighed the whole fucking box, okay? They weighed all the container. They weighed everything, and they charged me with that weight, right? So back in the day, you had this big bag, a garbage bag full of something you wanted to throw away. You knew it was garbage, the police didn't know it was garbage, or you wanted to get rid of it. So they give it to us bakers. We were like, yay! And then we turned it into a whole bunch of butter and hide it in the freezer. So that was just part of the culture at the time, but you don't have to do that. What I recommend to people, this is the greatest way to begin, is to just make a shake flour. And once you have your shake flour, you can keep that in a mason jar in the fridge, airtight, and then you just wait. What does your recipe call for? Is my recipe salmon? Well, I use the fat from salmon. Is my recipe cookies? I'll put a butter in it. In this recipe for cookies, I use grapeseed oil, right? Say your recipe doesn't call for butter at all, and all you've got is all your wheat and the butter, right? So marijuana recipes made easy requires a couple things. It requires the most important tool of all when you're baking with salmon. When you're baking with marijuana, this is the most important tool. You can get a smaller one. This is a scale. You can get smaller kitchen scales, and I'll tell you why. There's fine grind and there's fine grind, right? And so I could grind, this whole thing of cannabis into a half a cup or a quarter cup. I could just keep grinding. So this notion of measuring is dead. It's not going to work in your cannabis kitchen. Get yourself a scale. Now here's the other thing, and this is a really great rule of thumb for cooking for the average human, okay? Now the average human, that's a wild statement to make. So I'm going to make a batch of cookies that makes 20 cookies, and 20 people are going to eat them. My rule of thumb is this. If I'm using a lower grade cannabis, like just shake or all the stuff, I personally wouldn't, but I would give you the rule of thumb if you're using shake, use up to, but never exceed 1 gram per person. In fact, that's a crazy amount of weed right there. That is a crazy amount of weed for a person. The best amount of weed might be 0.5 gram or less per person per serving. So you got a cookie recipe, it's going to make for 20 people. Why not weigh up 10 grams of cannabis, and then what's the fat that the cookie calls for? Then we're going to add that 10 grams to the actual amount of fat that the recipe calls for, and we're just going to make that. And we don't have to put all our cannabis in a butter and pray to God the recipe asks for butter, okay? So that's really important, and I'm just going to show you really quickly how one makes shake flour. I just brought, some people use it for grinding coffee, but most people call it the Bud Buster. You know it. I use a Vitamix at home. I didn't have it. But you're just going to put your wheat in here without any big, huge sticks or anything that's going to compromise your blender. And you're just going to grind it into a fine powder. See, there's kind of a big stick. So I just grind this into a nice fine powder. Now this, if you wanted to prepare something, prepare your shake flour, put that in the fridge, and then come back every time you're ready to do it, right? Let me give you a great way to get high, super quick. You need to get somebody baked. You don't have time to bake cookies. You don't know what to do. Take a fry pan, put a tablespoon of butter in it, put a half a gram of wheat in it. Get that sauteing, crack some eggs, scramble those eggs, put that eggs on toast, green eggs and toast. Dr. Seuss knew. Long before we knew, but you can do it just that simply and that quickly. And I'm also experimenting lately with things without even using any fat at all. I'm experimenting with dry cannabis cooking. I'm going to talk about that, where I just cook cannabis dry now and I'm making jam. I'll tell you why I'm making jam, because you don't need to put it in your fridge or your freezer, and it's not going to go bad. It's going to keep for months, and you can put it anywhere. Anyways, I get sidetracked. I just try to do too many things at once. I'll try to follow along. So, I'm grinding this shake. You get a fine grind. This is another important tool, is a sifter, and a nice fine one. Because there's the cannabis that's great for baking with, and then there's the cannabis that's great for making t-shirts with. And so sometimes if you run it through a fine sieve on the top, it's going to leave the more fibrous. I mean, you can grind that again, but some of this gets kind of fibrous. You want to pull that off, make a t-shirt. Just kidding. Let's make a little bit. So I'm just going to make a little bit more. So ultimately, this is my plan today. I'm going to go through this making cannabis shake. We're going to talk a little bit more about dosage, oils, how to convert it. And then I'm going to make this huge batch of ginger snap cookies with anybody who wants to help me make it. And we're all going to decide how strong we want those cookies right here today, right? And everybody's going to take these cookies home and eat them at their leisure. So let's say, hypothetically, how strong, like I make a cookie and retail it, my cookies come at about 50 milligrams per cookie. That's 5 times the government standard. It's not great for a novice eater. How many milligrams would you guys like in your cookie? And we'll do the math together.
25.
You want a 25
1.
milligram cookie?
I want to counteract him with 1.
Well, how about you eat just a nibble of your cookie and share the rest?
Under 10.
So that's another thing too. We can decide how big or small. We can make a whole bunch of small little cookies, right? And they could all be 5 or 10 milligrams, and then you could decide how many.
Yeah.
You eat. So I want people to know that cooking with cannabis can be so exploratory, can be so adventuresome, and we all just get socked into this butter and what to do, and you can just go anywhere with it, right? I actually would here's another great one I do. Take a jar with all your marijuana you don't want to smoke, fill it, and then I pour tequila over it. And then I put the lid on. You all know this one? Yeah. And then after a couple weeks, or I strain it off, I make a medical margarita. Now medical margaritas cure everything. Bankruptcy, heartache, everything. Seriously, you gotta try these things. And what's interesting about a medical margarita in my research, here's a little known fact that maybe a lot of people don't consider when consuming cannabis. They always want to know how many milligrams, and that is a really good indicator of how high you're going to get. But the cookies we're going to make today, we're going to mill our own organic whole grain, because I'm a health nut. So we're going to make this whole grain, make it into flour. This is a complex carbohydrate. It's a lot for your body to break down. So you're going to eat it. Your body's got to work at that. It's going to take a little while for your body to get that into the bloodstream. Could take an hour or more to get high. Could take 4 or 5 hours to get unhigh, because it's a complex carbohydrate. Say you just want to put marijuana into a simple butter sugar solution, some kind of more simple sugar. Well, that's a little quicker, right? So the body's going to process that a bit quicker. So you have to think about the transit time or the vehicle time within which the food's going to go. So here's the thing. I make marijuana hamburgers at a barbecue I host every summer, right? We do all these marijuana burgers and medical margaritas. It's a party not to remember. And everybody comes to me on Wreck Beach the next day and like, oh my God, Water Melon, we're still high, okay? Why are they still high? Because marijuana clings to the fat in the hamburger, and the hamburger fat clings to your body, and it takes a little while for that hamburger fat to get out. So this is a little thing that maybe hardly anybody considers. A simple sugar versus a complex carbohydrate versus a protein, or now we're at tequila. Alcohol, fastest route into the bloodstream, also fastest route out of the bloodstream. So a medical margarita is fun, but it's more like a roller coaster. Like you have it and you're like, woo, and you're kind of high for maybe 20 minutes, 40 minutes, and then it goes away because it's processing through your body as quickly as the alcohol is. So that's an interesting tidbit of information that maybe a lot of people don't consider. So sure, it has 25 milligrams. I put 25 milligrams on a steak. I'm going to be high. I put 25 milligrams in a gummy bear, which is gelatin, corn syrup, and food dye. Why? Why, people? Do we need those things? That's really simple. I don't know. One of these gummy bears are bugging me, but okay. All right.
What do you think about putting vegetable glycerin? Using that like in your coffee or whatever?
This is what I think in my experience, and especially when I deal with people in cannabis. You all seem to be, more educated. You live in a community cannabis. But when you talk to somebody who's new, who's just come to cannabis, here's what's happened. Their granddaughter or their friend went in and bought them a product, usually a gummy bear or something. And they've eaten that gummy bear and it's given them relief. And that's what's mapped onto their mind. Does anybody understand when your brain maps something? So once it's mapped it, they're like, I need the gummy bear, right? And you're like, they don't understand that gummy bear is just, ultimately in the future, people I think would take a tincture and you go drop, drop, and you put the tincture down. Why in God's name you need to add food dye, corn syrup and gelatin, I don't know.
No, not the gummy, just the.
But I think it was just that gummy bear. Again, it was a cultural thing. It was
not-
a
not the
fun
gummy,
way
but
to.
Just vegetable glycerin.
You can do that too. I'm
Yeah.
just saying. Eventually, why put them in these things when you could just put it in your mouth, put it on your body? It just seems silly to me. But I think it's a lot to do with mapping.
Does glycerin?